So, right off the bat, I have to admit that I didn't actually want to make this video since it would be short like all my other recent ones. I wanted to come back after 7 months of being gone with something longer and with actual stuff drawn, but unfortunately for me, ever since Russia threw down, I've been asked, so what's happening in Ukraine, by everyone around me 20 times. So for my own sake, I'm making this video so I can just send it to them. The most digestible way I can explain this conflict from top to bottom is to identify the who, where, what, and why of both sides. So let's begin with the who. The leaders of both countries involved are Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and more infamously Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin is a former KGB spy who then became mayor of St. Petersburg and then eventually became president of Russia in 2000. Despite being called president, he and his inner circle are basically an autocratic regime, controlling nearly all aspects of government, society, and the media. The lesser-known Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is a former actor, Jewish, and grew up speaking Russian. He ran for the Ukrainian presidency in 2019, focusing on issues like anti-corruption and cooperation between Russians and Ukrainians. Zelensky won this election in a landslide, winning 73% of the vote. His balls are also bigger than most moons. Moving on to the where, Ukraine and Russia are both located in Eastern Europe and share a long history together. They're both Slavic, have a lot of parallels in their language and culture, but have enough differences to be considered separate, sort of like an American or British North and South divide. And in nearly every metric, from the military, economy, population, and size, Russia beats out on Ukraine by far. Now, to understand what happened, we need a very quick history lesson. Hundreds of years ago, the foundations for modern Ukraine and Russia were both laid in the same nation called Kievan Rus. Eventually, the Kievan Rus fell, with Ukraine going to Poland, Lithuania, and Russia largely going to the Mongolian Empire. At this point, this is where their cultures diverged. Eventually, Russia was united under Muscovy and expanded into the Russian Empire, taking Ukraine once again. For about 200 years, both countries have been under the same nation, even through regime change. This lasted up until the 1990s, when the Ukrainians voted nearly unanimously to leave the USSR, making Ukraine and Russia separate once again. Ever since, Putin has been eyeing Ukraine, making moves in 2014 by annexing Crimea, and then supporting the rebels to bring back a region called Novorussia, which was originally given to Russian nobility after they beat the Ottomans. The fighting between the rebels and Ukraine quickly ground to a stalemate, and both sides signed a diplomatic agreement to stop the fighting. Twice. Since then, skirmishes and fighting haven't really stopped, and the rebels have made several failed attempts to push into Ukraine. This leads us to today, when to a shock to many, Russia declared war on Ukraine and is pushing into the country. Now, this leads us to the most interesting and hardest question to answer. Why? Why declare war and cause all this mess? Well, until we're able to map out Putin's brain and read his mind, then we can't really know for sure, but there's a few reasons we can speculate about. The first and most common argument is geopolitical. The historical norm for countries is that they want to make themselves as geographically secure as possible, which is why mountains and rivers are often borders for nations. Looking at Russia, it's quite flat with no nearby defensible positions, so their tactic is to use sheer land to distance themselves from any dangers and hold out what defensible positions they can. This is what both the Russian Empire and USSR did to survive World War II and Napoleon. Now look at modern Russia, and you'll see how NATO, their enemy, is closer than ever before. And if Ukraine joins NATO, which they were expressing interest of doing, that will be a disaster for Russia. A successful invasion of Ukraine would be able to secure the creation of a Russian buffer state against NATO. The second reason could be economical. Russia's current economy and future economy is quite bleak. Demographically, they are going to have to support a large number of retired old people while having a declining population. They are also very reliant on their export of oil and gas, making up 30% of their entire economy, 60% of all their exports, and 40% of their government's income. Ukraine, on the other hand, is a much more diverse economy and is a major exporter in iron and food, containing some of the most valuable soil in the world. Ukraine has a lot of potential, and Russia knows it. Considering that eastern Ukraine has a large number of Russian speakers, a Russian takeover may damage the economy in the short term, but be useful in the long term, helping diversify and boost the Russian economy as a whole. The third reason, and the one that's honestly not talked about enough, is politics. Putin is still a politician at the end of the day, and needs the support of his people to maintain power. His approval rating is usually around 80%. If you live in a democracy, that may seem strange to you, but you have to remember that Putin is still an autocrat. Most actions taken by the government are done through him, so he is held in higher account for all the good and bad done by the government. His approval rating must be high, or else he'll have to struggle to maintain his power and legitimacy. It consistently was around 80% for 10 years, up until 2011 when he pushed to remove term limits. He made a big rebound in 2014 when he annexed Crimea, but lost those gains in 2018 due to unpopular pension reform. His approval rating sunk to an all-time low of 59% during the pandemic, and to this day, Putin's approval rating is still at this low point between 60 and 70%. It's possible he's trying to replicate his popularity boost in 2014 by stoking nationalism and pushing the narrative that Russia's a bulwark against Western degeneracy and socialism, believing that giving the people a win would regain his political clout. These are the main three suspects for why Putin is doing what he's doing. But the funniest part about all this, though, is all the reasons I just laid out for you look like they're going to backfire. Yes, Russia is stopping NATO from expanding into Ukraine, but in the process, not only are they scaring their neighbors Sweden and Finland into NATO's arms, but they also made NATO swap into a disorganized mass of countries with competing interests into an incredibly cohesive and unified bloc, with every NATO member sending some sort of military aid to Ukraine, except for Iceland, because they literally don't have a military. Yes, Russia would benefit from having more land and people, but Europe, the US, and others are not holding back when it comes to sanctions, resulting in Russia being removed from SWIFT. If you don't know what SWIFT is, it's an organization that is basically a middleman for world banks, connecting them and currencies together. This was considered a nuclear sanction for a long time, and for a good reason. Even though Russia's only been off SWIFT for 3 days, 640 billion in Russian bank reserves are frozen, interest rates doubled to 20%, and the ruble lost a third of its value. And while the EU didn't block the sale of Russian gas and oil because of how dependent on it they are, they did stop their export of refinery technology to Russia and canceled the Nord Stream pipeline, hoping to economically damage them in the long run. Finally, yes, it's possible that this war will boost Putin's approval rating, but it's also possible it will do the opposite. You'll only get approval for a war if you're able to actually win the war, and even though it's quite early, the general impression is that Ukraine is holding their own. The US has been supplying Ukraine with Javelin missiles to take out Russian tanks, planes, and helicopters, and it's been working very well. If you want a reference to see how effective the Javelin missile is, the US Special Operations claimed that out of 300 Javelin missiles fired at tanks, 280 were destroyed. It's also the reason why Russia is failing to gain air superiority. The Javelin is so effective that it's becoming a symbol for Ukrainian freedom. Troops are also struggling to take Kiev, which, no shit, it's urban warfare, why would you just try and walk in? And casualties are estimated to be 9,000 Russians dead according to Ukraine, and 500 Russians dead according to Moscow. For reference, the US only lost 2,400 men over 20 years in Afghanistan, and Russia's only been in Ukraine for a week. This doesn't even touch on the rumors of Russian troops not being told they were going to war, or the insanely high morale of the Ukrainian people. I'm not going to make the call that Ukraine is going to make the war hell for Putin since it's so early, but right now it's really looking like they are. Even if Russian citizens are initially supportive of the war, this is not the same as annexing a chunk of land. This involves fighting the second largest military in their region. If Ukraine continues to go down fighting tooth and nail, assuming they'll go down at all, it means that there will be thousands of empty tables at Russian dinners, hundreds of billions of rubles wasted, and tens of thousands of young Russian men coming back to an isolated pariah state with an economy in shambles. It's all really strange the more I think about it, honestly. Go back a month and even I could have told you that if Russia directly went to war with Ukraine, they would be slammed with sanctions and lose billions of dollars. And I probably could have called that invading Ukraine wouldn't be a walk in the park considering its size and NATO support. So if my young preppy dumbass could have predicted this, how could the president of the largest nation on the planet not? Well, maybe Putin thought his military was stronger or more up to date. But if anyone would know about the quality of the Russian military, it would be the leader of Russia. We do know that Putin despises Ukraine to its core, believing that Ukraine was created by Lenin and has now been hijacked by a Nazi government propped up by the West so they can invade Russia. Yes, this is actually what he believes. That's the thing about autocratic countries. I can sit here and talk about the rationality behind their actions, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to one man. A man who was born and raised and served a nation much stronger, larger, and more prestigious than its current form. A man who witnessed his country slowly crumble and fall into chaos, shocked into a shell of its former self. A man who took charge of said nation for nearly 20 years and is quickly approaching the ripe old age of 70. Maybe this man who has always presented himself as a strong, calm, and collected leader was never really that stable to begin with. Maybe as he ages, as he gets weaker, as he loses time, he looks at the country he despises so much and starts calculating his risks. Risks which start looking more and more irrelevant as time goes on. After all, would he really want to be remembered in the history books as the corrupt guy who revived Russia's economy? No, that's obviously not enough. He needs to be remembered like the Tsar rulers he admires so dearly, as a strong conqueror who brings prosperity to his people and vanquishes his enemies. A strong man who everyone admires and respects. There lies the fatal flaw in autocracies. It's all dictated by one man, and all men are fallible. If you'd like to know more about Russian history and how they got to this point, then subscribe because I have a long video on modern Russia coming out soon. And if you live or know someone in Ukraine, I wish you the best. Beware of misinformation and have an excellent day.